So, Shawn, we are going to talk Underdog ADP now. We're going to look through a little bit of a draft that you have ongoing in progress, and you're drafting out of the second slot against some of the RotoViz writing team and a number of other people then from outside of that in there, but Peter Overzet in there as one of the heavy hitters. You have Curtis Patrick, Travis May, Blair Andrews, Dave Caban, lots of people in there. Connor O'Driscoll, who obviously pipped us to the post in the FFPC tournament. You are in the draft as it's in progress. There's about 8 rounds through. What are you seeing from some of the early round ADP? And obviously this is a 0.5 PPR scoring setting.
Yeah, and Michael Dudner set this up. He recently published a couple of fantastic articles on how to attack best ball leagues. The most recent one was sort of debunking some myths about best ball drafts prior to the NFL draft. So if you haven't gotten in there and checked that out, you'll want to do it. It'll really help you in terms of how you approach these drafts through the next month or so. The underdog here is really interesting, as you mentioned, because it's half PPR, but you do have to start 3 wide receivers. So if you get into kind of a weird situation like we got in last year with the FFPC, where our running backs were actually stronger, you can't play 4 of them here. And so that's going to influence how you attack this. So you have the half PPR, but you also have the start 3 wide receivers. And that makes it interesting because one of the things that we have talked about a lot for the early portion of 2022, and we'll see how this develops, right? It's a possibility that we'll have more QB trades. It's a possibility that after the NFL draft, a few of these teams that look really weak at QB will at least look more dynamic from the perspective of a rookie QB maybe gives them a little more upside, even if it gives the incredible downside like we saw last year from Zach Wilson. But right now, there are a lot of wide receivers who, because of the quarterback play, feel like difficult choices, right? Especially in those first 4 or 5 rounds. And so this area that drafters have discussed for the last 3, 4, 5 years, however you want to look at, and said, okay, well, wide receiver is deep here. You can start at running back and then you can pivot to wide receiver. We've talked about the reasons that doesn't necessarily work. And we've talked about the reasons why that actually flows very well into either a 0 RB or a modified 0 RB approach. The flip side of that is that this year, where I think that not only is wide receiver not deep, but it's more or less non-existent, right? That creates some real difficulties because now you have this push to start with a couple wide receivers in the first 2 rounds and then maybe pivot off of that. And one of the things that's a challenge there is that if you look at the roster construction explorers, that hasn't necessarily worked, right? This idea of what we might call an upside down draft, or what we might call wide receiver, running back, or wide receiver, and then a running back, and then maybe you pivot to the onesie positions. That type of thing has been weaker than trying to do sort of your attempt to grab a legendary running back and then a lot of wide receivers with an elite tight end in there. So 2022 is going to be a lot of fun because most of the things that we know have worked, we can see, number one, why they might work again, because that particular structure is so dominant. But the flip side is that there are reasons why it could be very tricky. And then if you try and pivot, you're putting yourself into this position where you're pivoting into an approach that has been very unsuccessful. And so are you willing to take that risk to kind of jump out into the unknown there? And so that kind of brings me back to my draft, where I have the second pick. Christian McCaffrey goes off the board at the 101. That's not necessarily a surprise, although Jonathan Taylor, and I'm going to have an article on this soon, I think is kind of rising again now for me. So you and I did a draft recently where we had the 102 and McCaffrey did go 1. We had the option to take Taylor and we passed and we took Cooper Kupp. Cooper Kupp, interesting, he actually goes as the 6th pick in this draft, which I don't see how he gets below number 5 in a draft. And I really think that probably 2 or 3 is where he should be. But I went ahead in this draft and I took Taylor, and then obviously Colm, that creates a challenge because you know when you take Taylor that probably you're not going to be happy with the receivers who come back to you. And in this draft, we have Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Cooper Kupp, Devontae Adams all going in the first round. You come back through guys like Tyreek Hill, CD Lamb, AJ Brown, T. Higgins gone by the middle of the second round. A couple picks ahead of mine, Hassan takes Jalen Waddle. He and I chatted a little bit. He was looking at Waddle or Swift there. And then when it gets to me, my choices are basically Swift, DeAndre Hopkins, Keenan Allen, or perhaps Kyle Pitts. And obviously, and this is something that came up in our draft as well, I do have a tight end that I like a little bit later, so I'm willing to pass on Pitts there. Not knowing what I did or not having kind of spoiled that yet for the listeners, what are your thoughts here? How would you have attacked this pick?
Yeah, I'm not going to spoil it, but I was going to ask you about your start to the draft, because obviously no one for zero RB drafting. This draft, for when we start to talk through it a little bit more, is very much not zero RB. We'll let the listeners in on that part so far. I do think that round one went, in terms of ADP, not as expected, but the players in those first 12 picks are the players we would expect to be in those first 12 picks, but maybe in different orders. I keep coming back to this thought in my head, and I've mentioned it a few times, that with all the change this offseason, with how some players last year performed so well and some players then that maybe were expected to perform well didn't perform well, I think there's going to be more, I think I'm going to use the word chaos in ADP this year based on all those changes. And it might be a case where ADP never truly settles to a consensus. I think we'll see there be consensus ADP, but what we'll also see is these drafts where, like you said, Cooper Kupp goes 6th, then Cooper Kupp goes 2nd. I think we're going to see things like that. I've seen in a few drafts so far players going in the 2nd and 3rd round who, in terms of ADP, are going in the 5th, and we're starting to see things. And maybe that's because it's so early, but it feels like that may continue throughout the offseason. I think in terms of the players that you mentioned there, I feel that is the players and they're now, this being non-tight end premium, but obviously tight end still being a huge resource to have at the onesie positions. DeAndre Swift, Kyle Pitts, DeAndre Hopkins, Saquon Barkley are probably the players that are in the mix there. You mentioned Keenan Allen as well. I do feel like the T. Higgins is the end of that next tier of wide receivers for me, and Waddle would have been in that, but now has been bumped out after the Tyreek Hill trade. So to let the listeners in on it, you did go with DeAndre Swift. Anyone listening to our shows last year will know how much we were all in on DeAndre Swift last year, even with the injury news and the concerns around that heading into the season. So I think you made the right call based on the players available, but you did touch on it, and this is something that we do talk about a lot. When you take Taylor with that pick at the 102, you're looking at the options that may come to you then at the 211, but you're also looking at the options then at the 302 again. And in this situation, and what we're seeing in a lot of drafts is if you are picking between pick 1 and 3, maybe pick 1 and 4, it's a lot of running backs that are going then in that 2nd and 3rd turn. So I would imagine that was a concern for you, but when you selected Swift, then what is your thoughts of where are these wide receivers going to come from? Because you're after mentioning a moment ago that the depth is pretty much non-existent. So we've gone 2 rounds with no wide receivers, and you can let the listeners know there's going to be a 3rd round here with no wide receivers for Shawn Siegele.
There was, and DeAndre Hopkins went at the turn there, and he was the other player I was seriously considering. I had mentioned on the draft show that Ben and I did. We did an FFPC sit and go, and those episodes are in the progress of coming out over the next week. The first one was out. The other 2 will be out this week while Ben is on vacation. That I do think that the Cardinals players are mildly discounted. I think that once the hubbub over Kyler Murray and his, sort of his maturity, his injuries, how he's developing as a passer, once that calms down, these guys are going to get a little bit more expensive again. DeAndre Hopkins actually very good last season before he got hurt. And when we're looking at whether or not players are going to bounce back, how they performed in that season before whatever it was that derailed them is pretty important. So a big difference there between Hopkins and, say, Allen Robinson, who was available and just played very, very poorly. Now, the other receiver that I should mention, I probably should have considered more strongly, would have been Mike Evans. We have a reason to believe that the Buccaneers passing offense will be explosive again. Chris Godwin probably not going to be 100% and the big contributor until fairly late in the season. And then Russell Gage, we know, is a little bit more of a possession threat, just a guy to kind of bridge them to the point where they can be more explosive again. And so Evans now sets up as a potential, I mean, he could be the overall wide receiver 1. So probably someone I should have paid more attention to here. He's not someone I've drafted a lot over the last several years. I'm not huge on the other Buccaneers. Chris Godwin is really the player I like there, but he obviously is a difficult draft in 2022. Yeah. So we kind of move into this, and Saquon Barkley is still there, right? And Barkley, we know a lot of his value, if they use him correctly, is going to come in the receiving game. Those running backs are not quite as popular in a half PPR format. There are some situations in which they might not score as many points. But you look at Swift, you look at Barkley, if those offenses get better, I think the touchdown upside, which we're really focused on here, improves. And so there are scenarios in which Taylor, Swift, and Barkley for next season would all be top 5 picks. And we're trying to figure out how we want to put these teams together. We're looking at guys who have the chance to vastly outperform. There are some other good players kind of in this range. Joe Mixon goes one spot before Swift. Antonio Gibson goes one spot after. I think those guys are good players and potentially even better players for 2022 when you look at their floor or maybe even their median outcome. But I don't think that you're going to look at those guys and think, okay, well, in 2023, if things go right, they're going to elevate into the top half of the first round. They're just not quite that guy. Now, other players who maybe have a little bit more of that, Dalvin Cook goes in the middle of the second round. Alvin Kamara goes kind of mid to late second. Both of those players have a little bit of this off-field element hanging over them, similarly to the situation we kind of saw last year with Deshaun Watson. I think Cook, if those questions go away, explodes back up into the middle of the first round because we have reason to believe this Vikings offense will actually be much more explosive in 2023. Kamara is kind of hamstrung with this new situation with the Saints, where he's much more of a run-heavy back. That doesn't play to his skill set. It increases the chance that he gets injured. But we do have some big talents in the middle of the second round. But the reason that they're there is because the desperation for receivers, even in this particular format, pushes them down, right? So Peter, for example, starts his draft with Devontae Adams and A.J. Brown. We know that he used a wide receiver-heavy approach to finish in the top 10 overall of the Underdog tournament last year. It's a viable way to go about this, even in the half PPR. And so that's the start that I made. The receivers obviously dry up again before we get to round 4. The question is, does my big tight end star fall to me in round 4 like he didn't quite in the never too early draft that you and I did? Where do I go back in round 5, make a little bit of an upset pick there as well? I actually went a little bit off my board to get a different passer than the one I have rated as the best value in that situation. But Colm, this was a lot of fun. Michael's going to have content up on the site about this, reactions from the different participants, his own analysis. He's one of the best ball analysts in the business. So if you haven't checked out his work on RotoViz, make sure you go and do that.
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree with that. And Shawn, I mentioned this last year, and I'm going to mention it again, and it's just a coincidence. We like Jonathan Taylor, we like Deandre Swift. You mentioned again Taylor Swift. I think that there has to be a RotoViz overtime team this year that is named Taylor Swift in one of these drafts. So we will make it happen at some point. But
you're just wanting to get permission to use that music in the intro. You're like, I don't care what NFL players, but if we can,
that's what I could even do. I could get Jonathan Taylor followed by DeAndre Swift, and it would say Taylor Swift in the intro to the show, and then I would really be delighted. But we will let the listeners in. You teased it earlier. I can't let it go. We're not going to go through the rest of the draft, but through these opening 4 rounds, you have Jonathan Taylor, you have DeAndre Swift, you have Saquon Barkley. The player you were targeting in the 4th round did come to you, and he is, for long-time listeners of the show, for recent listeners of the show, they will know exactly probably who we're talking about, but it is TJ Hawkinson going off the board at the 4-11 in this particular draft. But you have made the case before. I don't know if you want to make the case again, but I'm sure you were counting down those picks, hoping that he would last to you there.
I was. And one of the things that we see with some of the other RCEs, that even when you don't have the tight end premium element, that elite tight ends are key to winning, right? And so they're a little bit cheaper when you don't have the tight end premium, but that doesn't mean that you want to avoid them or not have them as part of that construction. You can get them without having to pay quite the same price that you might. I mean, I think Hawkinson is very clearly a 3rd round value in the tight end premium, but if you can get him at the back end of the 4th or sometime in the 4th, even early in the 5th, which you do see him go to in some underdog drafts, then I mean, you want him there, right? You look at his advanced stats, and we get those in the Stealing Signals tool on the site. In my Never Too Early Best Ball tiers, I talk about why Hawkinson is the guy who's going to move into that range and be a star this next season. You should have him in Dynasty. Obviously, you still have some concerns with the QB there. Maybe those concerns actually get a little bit worse if they do go with one of the rookies. I think they'll add a rookie at some point in the draft, and then we'll see when that transition happens. If it happens kind of as you're moving from the regular season to the fantasy playoffs, then that wouldn't necessarily be ideal, because that rookie QB, even if he's a long-term upgrade, playing in his first NFL games, that could be a little bit of an issue for you. But Hawkinson, I don't think there's any question at this point about his talent. He was drafted very early in the reality draft. He has been good for the Lions. If he can stay healthy, he's going to join that group of stars. And I think for a long time, then you're going to see him as someone who really could be the heir to Travis Kelce, right? So in all formats, make sure you're getting some exposure. You don't want to get to the point where if he gets hurt, then your entire 2022 season is ruined. But he's someone who could have a big impact on what you do this next year. So Colm, it's been a lot of fun to do this underdog draft. We're going to have a lot of underdog content over the next couple of months. For listeners who are excited to get involved and play some underdog themselves, we have a coupon code. It is straightforward. It'll be easy to remember. It's RotoViz, and that will give you a up to $100 match on your initial deposit. So make sure you get over there, play a little bit of underdog, get yourself some experience so that you can then get in and dominate some of these big tournaments. We mentioned Peter Curtis Patrick is going to be doing the newsletter, and he absolutely dominated underdog last year. I don't know if he wants me giving away just how much money he made, but it was a lot. And if you were a newsletter subscriber, then you found out kind of as the season and as the offseason progressed that he had a lot of Cooper Kupp. And I think anybody who knows how last season panned out, that was a very good pick. You'll get Curtis's top guys for 2022 when you subscribe to the newsletter. There also will be lots of different opportunities to get some little bonuses and discounts to these various games. So if you want to play underdog, you want to play with some of our other partners, you'll have some opportunities there. The newsletter is your place to be. You'll get free RotoViz content. Make sure you're signed up for that. If you are a listener to the podcasts, you won't regret it. It'll be something that really helps out, fun to read during the week, and then gives you little nuggets that will allow you to make money. Maybe not quite as much as Curtis made last year in Underdog, but the opportunity is there if you combine our player selections with the structural drafting that we emphasize. So use the coupon code, subscribe to the newsletter. We've got you for 2022. It's going to be a fun ride.
Did you enjoy that clip? Make sure you hit that subscribe button to get more content from RotoViz. And of course, you can check out full-length podcasts at rotoviz.com/podcast. Available on all podcast platforms. Check out our wide range of content. Once again, rotoviz.com/podcast.